Welcome back to part two of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. You know the drill. We're going to continue to record on Wednesday morning. Now, I don't always do an opening thought before my second half, but I'm going to do one today. Lynn Ekdahl, our fabulous political poet, sent me a poem entitled Problem, Religious States. And here is her poem. Of Israel to be a critic does not make one anti-Semitic. Israel as a sovereign state, a legitimate target of debates. And now accused of genocide, Israel faces a rising tide of criticism often strong, denouncing it as in the wrong. The problem is a religious state. For one religion, it operates. Let any religion control a state, and multiple problems you create. What becomes of those who are other? Inclination, them to smother, perhaps them to demonize. And when you do, compassion dies. Any religion can play this role as it pursues complete control. Think India, a Hindu state. Increasingly, its Muslims hates. Think Ireland, where Protestants on Catholics showered great contempt. The potato famine genocide as countless Irish left or died. But all Hindus do not share the blame, nor all Protestants the shame. Most Jews, of course, neither share nor own Israeli actions they don't condone. So of Christian nationalists, beware. Good Muslims they already scare. Maintaining our religious freedom protects us all, not only some. And we were doing an interview about the separation of church and state the other day. That was absolutely fascinating. So if it is Thursday, it must be race class. We offer race class once a month. We've been doing it now for 4 or 5 years. We offer it with Jonathan Feingold, who's a law professor at Boston University. And when we first decided to do race class, this was what the press release said. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, BU Law Professor Jonathan Feingold and myself are offering a class called Race Class. We offer it once a month. It's a course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. In describing the foundational purpose of Race Class, Jonathan Feingold noted, quote, "We know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means," close quote. Welcome back to our regularly scheduled Thursday, Jonathan. Thank you so much for doing this for so long. And I feel like when we started, we were a bit naive. I don't think we realized, or maybe you did, that we would be at a place that we are right now. But I think it's ironic when I was asking, what would you like to talk about? You referred to an article at The Nation magazine, and it was entitled, "The Dismantling of Black Studies. Everyone committed to democracy, intellectual freedom, and the rule of law should be alarmed at what is happening and be prepared to act." So I feel like we've taken out a big erasure, and we're trying to erase anything that's not white. We're trying to erase anything that was a mistake. We're trying to erase anything that would sort of suggest that we have set so many communities up to fail just by the policies we've embraced. And therefore, if you can erase all those things, somehow you can protect those in power. So let me welcome you back to the program. And you made the decision that you wanted to talk about Black studies. So let's begin that conversation.
Thanks, Arnie. Nice to be with you. And I was just this morning thinking back on sort of when we started and the time since then, and things are far worse. The dynamics that we were discussing, the attacks on public education foundationally, but really students' ability to learn about race and racism, about gender identity, patriarchy, misogyny. The attacks were more, in a sense, experimental. You know, they were, um, the, as folks will say, the laboratories of fascism in places like Florida,
Right.
and particular institutions like New College of Florida were the target of really vicious, defamatory, you know, distortions and attacks rhetorically and otherwise. But it was somewhat more isolated. And now we have both an effort to nationalize the sorts of attacks on knowledge that we saw in Florida 4 or 5 years ago via the Trump administration by using quite deftly the federal bureaucracy um, in whether it's new requirements in grants for federal grants um, and what we're seeing play out right now is efforts to rewrite federal regulations around accreditation standards as a way to control higher education, universities, to essentially turn universities into an arm of a state apparatus that desires a society that looks much more like the 1920s and 1930s, in which you had both formal Jim Crow and racial apartheid, but also a period where you had some of the most violent and racist immigration policies. And
I was hoping you were going to get to immigration policies because let me also remind everyone that the idea of immigration policy in higher ed is very important, especially for a lot of public institutions, because it is the immigrant student. It is the student that comes from India or the student that comes from France or wherever around the world, and they come and they go, I'm from China for that matter, and they come to these institutions. Not only do they bring a diversity of thought and a diversity of experience to those institutions, but guess what, Jonathan? They pay full freight. And as we know, we're starving our higher ed. And by basically sort of hiding behind this idea of immigration and about allowing these students to come into America, you are actually reinforcing how quickly you will starve these institutions because you are not only denying them the opportunity to sort of bring the world into this academic setting, but you're denying them essential dollars. So between the assault on grants and immigration, they're starving them as well. And it's very successful because, you know, they're going to blame them for not being financially feasible, but they actually created that reality.
right, and we could have a different conversation about how we finance higher
Yeah, I
education in
agree.
this country. And I think what I would say is, well, we should actually pay for higher education and we should make it free.
Yeah.
Because if you want to, if you're actually invested in um, building trust, well, one of the easiest things to do is actually just make higher education affordable and not a, a mechanism that reproduces privilege and puts people in debt such that they have to, essentially allow their labor to be exploited by large corporations who are part of the broader Trump MAGA network
Right.
that is invested in a society that is really defined by domination as opposed to democracy. And I think this sort of circles back to Black studies as well. And so if you think of the personalities that have been leading both the legislative and the rhetorical attacks on higher education and anti-racism and critical race theory, folks who we've talked about a lot, individuals like Christopher Rufo, but then also I think less known individuals like William and Bowden, who's the new provost, relatively new provost at the University of Texas, what they will say when they offer their really sort of mythologized narratives of the United States is that everything was good up until the late 1960s.
Yes.
But I think this matters because they will timestamp when, everything was good, when we had trust, when we were doing it right, and then when everything went wrong. And what they are timestamping is the end of formal apartheid in the United States and in higher education, which did not only mean opening up institutions to everyone, or at least eliminating formal prohibitions, though, as we know, many institutions took many years to actually become meaningfully, or at least more meaningfully, inclusive. But what you also had at the end of the 60s, and this was the direct result of the student-led activism and protest that universities, on the one hand, celebrate and have statues honoring and placards giving homage to, though when their current students engage in the same sorts of activism, they will call in the National Guard and beat
Yes.
up their students. But what you had is you had calls to not just open up universities that had been dominated by, more privileged men who are white, not just open it up to everyone, but to actually transform what universities were doing and to really ask whether or not universities had been oriented towards the common good, even in a baseline way. And so what those protests yielded were sites of academic inquiry, like African American studies departments, Black studies, as we opened.
Gender
Other,
studies, because let's also remember you're not only talking about opening it up to blacks, you're also, and people of color, you're talking about opening it up to women. Because I remember when Dartmouth went co-ed, okay? I remember that like it was yesterday. And I also remember that people look at affirmative action and are so horrified at affirmative action until they realize that the people that benefited the most from it were white women. I mean, again, it was a white male enclave, okay? And when they opened it up, let's also remember that they were also recognizing women as well as being part of the fabric of this concept of higher ed. And I think, sometimes I want to lock arms with race because I don't want it to be separated from what it also meant for people like me, Jonathan. Does that make sense?
so of course it makes sense, and
Oh
a
God.
different, but and I think when you say people like me, you mean someone who identifies as a woman and as white,
Yes, yes,
right? Because
I
then,
do.
and
That is the. I mean, I can't undo me the way you can't undo Black history, the way you can't erase it. This is who me is. But the door was shut on me too.
100%. I guess
Ah,
part of me just sort of making that point explicit is that the ways in which higher education has been a barrier to different people is both a
yes,
function of race and a gender, and a function of race and gender.
yes,
And
exactly,
so
yeah,
to the extent
exactly.
like to and so like we might ask the question why, like, particularly in certain fields, you might have seen sort of the increase of sort of women and a presence, but to the, it there's going to be cases in which it's predominantly white women. And so then the question is, how do we actually think about transforming institutions so they're actually thinking about different systems or mechanisms of exclusion or subordination in ways that are going to be affecting different people differently as a function of their, we would think of their intersecting identities.
Right.
Another reason why I think it's so valuable that you named gender studies in addition to sort of the race studies and ethnic study centers is both gender studies, both the study of gender, of patriarchy, and race studies centers and disciplines uh, are both under attack.
Yeah, they're both being dismantled.
They're
Exactly.
both being dismantled. And so if you look at Florida, if you look at UT, and so right now I just, UT, if you look at Texas, so Texas is a really interesting, I mean, really horrific. This Texas state legislature, I think, just sort of modestly one could describe as a overwhelmingly Christian nationalist, and a
Hmm.
turn that it actually looks different than, 10, 15 years ago. But that sort of, worldview, that vision, and this in a sense sort of reconnects to the opening poem, but it is hostile to a society in which people are equipped to, think critically about and demand a world without racial or gendered hierarchies.
Well, they've defined what is the in group and what is the out group. And again, because they get to define the parameters of that, it always is so frightening because, and we're seeing with Donald Trump, what is the in group? And it's not even Christian, it's evangelical white Christian. And so they keep refining it down and down and down, Jonathan. So they push more people into out. and fewer people into in. And I want to, this was Memorial Day weekend. And I posted something on my Facebook page. Again, it's kind of like the erasure of history. But you know what, also, Jonathan? So we think that things started to open up and we started to learn. But there was so much we didn't learn. And I was reading the very first Memorial Day, originally called Decoration Day, occurred on May 1st, 1865, in Charlestown, South Carolina. It was organized by formerly enslaved Black Americans and Union troops to properly rebury 257 Union soldiers who had died in a Confederate prison camp. Know your history, don't let it be forgotten. So I posted that story and I wrote, will this be taught in classrooms across America? And then I asked the second question, Jonathan, was it ever taught? Was it ever taught? So we are missing so much in our knowledge of history. We were just beginning to scratch the surface with African American studies and gender studies and all. And now what are they doing? They're basically making sure that at every institution of higher ed, that those studies disappear. It becomes generic and not specific.
Right. And I think one of the important things to observe is that the same state legislatures and universities within those states that have since essentially become captured by a sort of right-wing political interests are not just trying to demean and dismantle Black studies and gender studies, Mexican American studies, but are also engaged in quite obviously racist gerrymandering in
Right.
order to eliminate the ability for people in their states who are not white to be able to meaningfully participate in a democratic political process. And these are also the states that have had the most aggressive attacks on reproductive autonomy.
Right.
And these are also the states that are systematically trying to defund K through 12 public education. And just part of the basic observation is that if you have political entities who are invested in some form of anti-democracy, in which it's actually a small concentrated group of people who get to choose what happens, like where resources are deployed, how people live their lives, who's exposed to different sorts of environmental pollutants and contaminants, who wins and who loses, then what you do is you try to dismantle all of the places in which regular people gain the capacity to actually participate in public life, in making the choices that are necessary in order to make their lives better. And so you can trace much of this, much of the hostility that we're seeing today to Black studies and gender studies to the summer of 2020, when we had a global uprising for Black lives
Right.
and against police violence and state violence against people racialized as Black. And in that moment, what we saw, and we've talked about this before, is that what people were demanding in demanding that the United States reckon with racism was also connected to a recognition that the economic system was one that dominated and crushed everyone.
Yeah.
The claim that you need to take seriously racism was not just about making the United States live up to its ideals with respect to racial equality, but it was also a recognition that the way in which racism functions, manifests in U.S. society, is actually a precondition to the sort of just corporate oligarchy, sort of capitalist overlord dynamics where most of the people in the country actually do not have the ability to control the decisions that affect their lives and are trapped in just a horrific just capitalist rat race where
Right.
you're constantly just having to do just enough to get by. But the observation 2020 again in 2021 when we had direct government just payments to people and a moment of a more sort of socialisty arrangement, it was just this recognition that, oh, it turns out we could structure U.S. society much differently in a way where we actually took care of people,
Yeah.
where we made sure, like, where we paid for healthcare, we paid for education, we paid for housing. And so to understand the massive backlash against that. That is, which also traces to backlash to the very fact that we had a black president
Right.
who was quite mainstream and
Oh,
actually rather conservative in different respects.
yeah.
Um, but it was the fact that exposure to certain ideas actually woke people up and made them realize that we could be different than we are.
And I think that that's the fear, because there's the power in the difference. And what they are playing to is basically sort of assuring people that you're stronger and better if you're the same. And of course, the only same is, again, the in group that we're looking at right now. I got to ask you a question, though, before you go, because the NAACP is calling on black athletes to begin to step away from the southern states that have basically embraced gerrymandering. I thought that was a brilliant idea, because they are racist except when it comes to football. They're racist except when it comes to basketball.
Well,
They're right.
still
They're still right.
racist.
Yeah. But they use black bodies to attract money, to attract attention, and all of a sudden, this is the use they want. And I think in a lot of ways, you need to remind them our bodies are not for you to use. Now, is this a crazy idea, or is it an appropriate one? Oh,
So, I guess a couple sort of quick thoughts and reactions. One is that I do think that we have to understand that structurally, we are right now much closer legally to 1920, 1930 than to 2015,
right. I
in
got you.
part because of the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act
Mhm.
and because of just the massive consolidation of power within, just um, corporate interests that are contrary to just sort of everyday regular people. There are many states, Florida is an example of this, Texas is an example of this, where they're much closer to sort of an authoritarian state than like meaningful sort of democracy. Um, and so part of that means that we actually need to quite seriously look to the way in which change happened prior to 1965, prior to 1954. And part of that is figuring out how to actually exert massive financial pressure, economic
Yes.
pressure,
Yes.
partly in order to crack alliances on the right. But it also means it's to be a different question is how you actually get entities with power, like the ABA Council,
Right.
the body that accredits law schools, to actually stand up in a moment in which you have, the Supreme Court is no longer legitimate in all
No,
sorts of ways.
yeah,
The
we've
rule
talked
of
about that.
law.
Yeah, it
Um,
doesn't exist. No.
but the question is going to be for everyone who cares about a society that is ruled by sort of democratic means and not domination, how to exert power collectively in order to push back against, because right now we are still in this moment where we don't know, and part of the question is just on us, what we do, whether it's going to be a short, 5 to 10 year period of
Mm.
backsliding, or whether we're in for a half century to 75, 100 years of, what we had post Reconstruction.
Well, I'm going to remind everyone that I'm going to beg you to find your voice. And sometimes finding your voice is basically scary and threatening. And the poem by Audre Lorde said, "It is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive." Oh my God. Oh my God. But so much is on the line, Jonathan. If it's Thursday, once a month, what do? We teach race class. And as Jonathan reminds us, we know race matters. Part of the reason why we teach this class is to make sense of what that actually means. Thank you for doing this, Mr. Feingold.
Thanks, Arnie.
You're welcome. This, everyone, is a Thursday edition of The Attitude. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.